So in Australia, we like to think that there are two different types of people. There are people who like their Vegemite, there's people who like Vegemite, and then there's people who are frankly un-Australian. I myself consider myself to be true-blooded Australian. In many ways, this is a sacred national dish, and by the looks of it, it can also be used to patch up roads. We should probably explain the state of the roads around here. Now, incidentally, the UK also produces a spread very similar to this. It's called Marmite, and like Vegemite, it is one of those dishes where, well, it's one of those spreads where you either love it or you hate it. There is no middle ground. Obviously for me, I love Vegemite, and in many ways, don't tell the rest of Australia, I actually prefer Marmite just a little bit more. But because it is famously something that you either love or hate, the term Marmite is given to things that people either love or they hate. No middle ground whatsoever. And in the fountain pen world, the equivalent to something being Marmite would be the Pilot Vanishing Point. Or in Australia, it's called the Pilot Capless. And whilst it doesn't really matter, Pilot Vanishing Point just sounds way better than Pilot Capless. Now the Pilot Vanishing Point is mainly known because it is a retractable nib fountain pen. And the reason why it's known as a Marmite fountain pen is because of the grip. The clip is integrated into it, and depending on how you hold a fountain pen, this will either be no issue at all, maybe a mild inconvenience which you can get over, or you absolutely hate it to death. And at least to me, this is a fountain pen which I've never really loved a whole lot. Well, not this one specifically. Before I get into the review too much, I do need to point out that this is not a Pilot Vanishing Point. This is in fact a Jinhao 10. And obviously being a Jinhao, it's not made by craftsmen in Japan, it's made by Jinhao in China. Now the big thing to say up front is obviously that this is a clone of a Pilot Vanishing Point. Yes, if you put this next to a genuine one, you could definitely tell that there are differences. For instance, the clip doesn't curve in a little bit near the center, whereas on a real Vanishing Point, it does. But on the whole, they got pretty close, and at least from a distance, you probably couldn't tell which one is which. Although my wallet can definitely tell the difference, because whilst a real Vanishing Point is about $250 to $300, this was only $22, so less than 1/10 the cost of an actual Vanishing Point. And say what you want, but Jinhao is certainly making full use of that $22. At least on first impressions, it seems to be a really solidly built fountain pen, and it's also a really solid fountain pen, in the sense that this is actually pretty heavy. I mean, look, Jinhao has never had any trouble making their pens heavy. I mean, the 159 and the 450, they were pretty solid fountain pens. And this one here, it's 33 grams, which is definitely on the heavier end for fountain pens. But when you take the fountain pen apart and look at everything that goes into making it work, you can see exactly why it's heavy, and at least to me, on first impressions, there wasn't anything that jumped out at me that presented a big red flag. There is a lot of steel and hard resin that goes into making this fountain pen, which means it'll handle, being thrown into a bag, being thrown into your pockets with keys, maybe dropping it every now and then. I mean, this is a pretty solidly built fountain pen, but the most important thing is the clicking mechanism, and thankfully that works well. I mean, it works just as good as any other, moderate to high-end clicking pen that I've used. It's smooth, it doesn't bind at any place, and it makes a satisfying click. The spring is a little bit stiffer than I would have liked, but apart from that, at this price point, you gotta say you are getting a pretty good deal here. And I only say all that because the last clicking fountain pen that I got, which was the Lambutu 3088, it had a clicking mechanism and it broke after about 3 tries, and it's never worked since. This one here, I can probably click it all day and it's gonna work just as well now as it would work at the end of the day. I mean, this is just leagues better than that. Now, is it gonna be better than the Pilot that's made in Japan? Probably not. Is it gonna be as good as the Mahjong A1 or A2? I don't know, I haven't used those fountain pens, but looking at this pen just by itself, not comparing it to anything else, you gotta say, A for effort, A for execution. They've done a good job, and there's nothing that immediately stands out as being a big problem, at least on this fountain pen. And I say that mostly because, whilst the quality control on the newer Jinhao pens is certainly a lot better than what I've dealt with in the past, the quality control is still not there. Having read other people's experiences with this pen, there seems to be some quality control issues to do with the nib, although that's somewhat expected on this type of fountain pen, but there's also a bit of variance in terms of how good the seal is for the nib. The trapdoor for the nib section isn't sealing correctly, and that's causing the nib to dry out and cause hard starts. Thankfully though, I seem to have gotten a really good example that doesn't seem to have any of those issues. But I do think it is important to explain what exactly the issue is. So on this fountain pen, as with most retractable nib fountain pens, the nib just doesn't sit inside the section when it's retracted. There's actually a small trapdoor which the feed pushes down as the nib comes out. You know, this is normally called the trapdoor, and it simply is there to help seal off the nib and prevent it from drying out. It's obviously not a perfect seal, there's no rubber in there and I can blow into it and air comes out, but it certainly does a better job than, say, nothing being there. I mean, think of a nib with no cap, it's obviously going to dry out, and I have some other fountain pens that have retractable nibs that don't use a trapdoor, and let's just say those things hard start like crazy. So the trapdoor definitely does do something, and whilst it may not be a perfect seal, the seal on this one is certainly good enough. And it seems that on some other pens, the seal is probably just a little bit worse, and that is causing the nibs to dry out, and obviously a dried out nib is going to hard start. But thankfully in my experience, having used this for a few weeks, I haven't experienced any hard starts at all. Say what you want, but this is a huge improvement over the Jinhao pens of maybe 10 years ago. You know, it's probably a much more complicated feed, you know, it's a lot smaller, and yet it is so much more reliable. Speaking of the feed, and I guess in the same vein, speaking of the nib, the whole nib and converter section is held in a separate unit, which you can remove. It looks really similar to the Pilot one, which probably isn't a huge surprise. To put it back in, there's a raised section and a guide to keep it straight. Now, it being Jinhao, they only offer this pen with a fine or an extra fine nib. So if you like a medium or a broad nib, like I do these days, you're going to feel a bit sort of left out to dry. Although the flip side of that is, you know, being such thin lines and the fact that the feed is quite dry, you're not going to be going through a whole lot of ink, so you won't be refilling this pen all that often. In fact, I've used this pen on and off for about 2 weeks and I still haven't gone through a whole converter. Obviously it's going to be a stainless steel nib, and interestingly, there's no breather hole. You know, that's not unheard of, but it's certainly unconventional. Compare this to the nib on the real Vanishing Point and it actually has a breather hole. I do find it a bit funny though that Jinhao put their logo on it, because it's always going to be obscured, and unless you pull the pen apart, you're never going to see it. Now the nib itself, at least in my opinion, it is nothing special, but it does work, which is the important thing. I got it in extra fine because that's all I could find it in, and you know, it does produce a pretty fine line. Certainly a lot finer than most of the other extra fine nibs that I've gotten from Jinhao. It's not Japanese extra fine, but it is pretty close, and if you have really small handwriting, this is probably going to be an okay nib for you. Combine that with the fact that the feed is also pretty dry, means you can use this pen to take notes on cheap, uncoated paper, which is what I normally use in my day-to-day life, and you can use it without any issue of, you know, bleeding or feathering. And on top of that, it's a very consistent pen. It doesn't hard start, and even though the feed does run on the dry side, it doesn't ever skip on me. Now it's not butter smooth, you know, there is a bit of feedback, especially on the side strokes, but considering how thin the grind is, I think they've done a really good job. Overall, they've done a pretty good job, it's just that the overall characteristics of this nib just generally don't suit what I want from a nib. You know, whilst it may not be for me, I don't want to mark it down too much because whilst, yes, it is a bit unremarkable, it's still a good nib, and in many ways, a lot of people do like this style of nib. At least for me, it's a little bit too stiff and a little bit too small. Although one thing that I do think is fair to criticise is that, at least with this pen, it feels like there is a bit of side-to-side movement with the nib unit itself. Obviously, it being a movable, you know, retractable unit, it needs some space to allow it to freely move inside the barrel. And even holding it like this, you can tell that there is some side-to-side movement. It feels like, you know, if I hold the nib on the page and move it, I'm able to move, you know, the pen body itself, whilst the nib sort of stays in the same place, if that sort of makes sense. Obviously, it is not a huge amount, you know, it's very difficult to capture on camera, but when I'm writing, I can certainly feel it. Now, is it enough to be a deal breaker? I'm not sure, you know, it really isn't a whole lot. It's in a weird grey zone where it's definitely there, but it's not there enough to be a real deal breaker. What is a deal breaker though to me and to quite a few other people is the ergonomics, and that all has to do with the clip. Obviously, it being a fountain pen, you do want to keep it stored upright, so if you bump it during the day, the ink doesn't leak out and go into the cap, or worse with this fountain pen, into your pants pocket. Obviously, to get around that, they put the clip at the top, so when you store it, the nib stays up. And as a result, it forms an integral part of the grip. And this is the whole, you know, you either love it or hate it. It is a Marmite grip, because depending on how you grip a fountain pen and how sort of sensitive you are to there being this clip here in the middle, you're either going to love it or hate it. Me, I have what's called a lateral tripod grip. So when I hold the fountain pen, my thumb comes all the way over the top and it pushes into my index finger. And the clip, you know, it is in the way, and at least to me, it's really uncomfortable. And, you know, to me, it is a big deal breaker. You know, I've gone 25 years with using pens with no clip down the middle, so it is a bit of a shock to the system to use a pen with a clip down the middle. It's just really distracting. Look, I can use this very easily to jot down notes. I can write a page full of notes just fine. But if I then needed to write, say, 12 pages of notes, say for example, writing out the script for this video, then it becomes a matter of no chance. It also doesn't help that I got this pen in the white trim with the polished silver. It is just the worst combination because these materials get so slippery so quickly. You know, I have moderately oily hands, and I could only use this for about 5 minutes before I needed to wipe this thing down or just readjust my grip. If you are going to get this fountain pen, I would recommend that you get the matte black over this one, because at least from what I've seen, the matte black handles oils a lot better than this finish. I do want to point out though that my dislike for this grip is only one side of the coin, because whilst I and quite a lot of people don't like this fountain pen, there are a lot of people who absolutely adore the Pilot Vanishing Point. Obviously, I'm talking about the Vanishing Point because it is the default go-to and the thing that this is based off. But if people love the Pilot Vanishing Point, there are people who are going to love this fountain pen. You know, there are people who have collections of Pilot Vanishing Points, you know, vintage, new, different types of nibs, different colors. To me, I find that just crazy because I find that pen so uncomfortable to use. But it just goes to show that people who don't care about the clip being there, they'll use this pen, and some people, they will just fall in love with it. That ain't me, but I do think the important thing to take away from that is the best use case for this pen is probably just as a tester to see if you would like to use the Pilot Vanishing Point. Because as I said before, Pilot Vanishing Points are expensive fountain pens, and there is certainly a chance that you end up not just disliking it, but actively hating it and probably wanting to return it. Now, the first time I used a Pilot Vanishing Point, it was at the Sydney Fountain Pen Show, and whilst I disliked it there, the person who let me use it said, whilst you'll probably dislike it at first, it's a pen that will probably grow on you. Bit of a hard sell when the pen is, what, $250, and there is still a chance that I go a month in and I still end up hating it. And that brings me back to this pen. I mean, it is not a 100% replica, but if you like this pen, the chances are that you are going to like the Pilot Vanishing Point. And that is probably the best use case for this pen. Because whilst the nib is just okay, you know, I'm sure you can put up with it just for a bit, it is the ergonomics that really matter with this pen. You know, buy this pen for 20 bucks, you can use it for a few months, see if you like it. If you fall in love with it and you want more from it, you know, say you want a better nib, or better yet, you want a medium or broad, which you can get on the Pilot Vanishing Point, you know, go ahead and upgrade to the Pilot Vanishing Point. And if you end up disliking the pen, well, thankfully, you only had to invest $22 to find out. Still a lot, but at least to me, it's still better than the hassle of getting a Pilot Vanishing Point, disliking it, and then having to go through the whole process of returning the pen. Now, the final thing that I'll say in this video is that I am aware that there is another Pilot Capless clone called the Mahjong A1 and Mahjong A2, and apparently the Mahjong A1 comes with a clipless version. Now I'm really interested in getting that fountain pen, so I'll be on the lookout for getting it. But until then, this pen, it's a decent pen, but it's certainly not for me. And with that, let's get into the writing sample. Alright, welcome to the writing sample for the Jinhao number 10. Obviously using a classic rodeo pad, so let's get into it. This is obviously, as I said, let me find the grip. This is a Jinhao number 10. This has an extra fine hooded nib, and the ink that I'm using is Parker Black. Pretty boring standard ink, but you know, it seems to work quite well in this fountain pen. Anyway, let's get into a writing sample. Alright, and that is the Jinhao number 10. Like I said before, there's pretty much nothing going on with this pen, but it is a good writer. The only thing that you might be able to hear is that on the side strokes, there is a little bit of noise, and that's the side-to-side motion of the nib that I spoke about earlier. Again, you probably can't see it in the writing sample, but I definitely can feel it, especially when I'm pushing down a bit harder. And if I do backwards and forwards, you might be able to hear it a little bit better. But outside of that, I mean, the nib itself is pretty well ground. For being an extra fine nib, they've done a pretty good job. Is it the finest extra fine nib ever? No, it isn't, but it's still pretty good. And as you can see, there's pretty much no line variation whatsoever. I was steadily increasing the pressure that I was putting down on the nib, and there's pretty much nothing. Now in terms of natural line variation, once again, there's pretty much nothing. It's a very, I guess, neutral type of nib. Now in terms of ink, like I said before, it's not putting down a huge amount. It's a little bit wetter than it was because I just refilled it, but usually it's not this wet. Now in terms of reverse writing, I mean, you wouldn't want to reverse write in this pen. If the grip was already uncomfortable, which it is for me, I mean, reverse writing, that is a whole nother level, but I'll do it anyway. And you know what? It actually reverse writes a lot better than I was expecting. Final thing I'll do is quick writing just to see how the feed keeps up. And as you can see, the feed keeps up quite well. Again, it is a little bit wetter than it normally is, but even with the feed normal, it would certainly be able to keep up with that. And that is about it for the writing sample with this fountain pen.